The first light of dawn stretched across the endless Montana prairie as Caleb Harper stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, watching a thin layer of mist drift over the fields. The land was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. Every fence post, every barn beam, and every acre of grass had been earned through years of hard work. Caleb had built the ranch with his own hands after losing both of his parents to illness when he was only 22. Now, at 34, he owned nearly 2,000 acres, a healthy herd of cattle, and the respect of every rancher within 50 miles. Yet when the day's work ended and the ranch hands rode home to their families, silence settled over the Harper Ranch like a heavy blanket. Caleb had grown used to the silence. His evenings followed the same routine. He cooked a simple meal, repaired broken tools beside the fireplace, and fell asleep in a house that felt far larger than one man needed. The loneliness no longer surprised him, but it had slowly become a constant companion. One chilly October afternoon, his longtime friend and neighboring rancher, Samuel Carter, stopped by after helping round up a stray calf. "You've got the finest ranch around," Samuel said as they leaned against the corral fence. "But a ranch isn't only fences and cattle." Caleb smiled faintly. "I know what you're trying to say. Do you?" Samuel looked toward the empty farmhouse. A place that size should have laughter inside it. Caleb remained quiet. Samuel continued carefully. "You're not getting any younger, Caleb. Have you ever thought about finding yourself a wife?" Caleb shook his head. "Love wasn't meant for me." Samuel frowned. "Who said anything about love?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper advertisement. "There are respectable agencies back east arranging marriages. Good women looking for honest lives out here. Mail-order brides." Caleb stared at the paper without taking it. "It sounds strange." "It might," Samuel admitted. "But plenty of good families have started that way." Caleb hesitated before finally accepting the advertisement. That evening, after Samuel left, Caleb sat alone at his kitchen table beneath the flickering glow of an oil lamp. The advertisement described women seeking new beginnings in the Western Territories. He read every line twice. Marriage. The word felt unfamiliar. He had buried every dream of romance years ago. His parents had loved each other deeply, but he had also watched grief destroy his father after his mother's death. Caleb had promised himself he would never allow anyone to hold that much power over his heart. If he married, it would be practical. Nothing more. He needed someone to help manage the household. Someday he hoped to have children who could inherit the ranch. Those were sensible reasons. Love only complicated things. After several days of thought, Caleb wrote a simple letter introducing himself. He described the ranch honestly, admitted that life would be difficult, and promised only respect, honesty, and a secure home. Weeks passed without a reply. Winter winds began sweeping across the plains. Then one snowy afternoon, the stagecoach driver handed Caleb an envelope. Inside was a carefully written letter. "My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 26 years old and originally from Boston. I have worked as a teacher and seamstress. I do not seek riches, only peace, honesty, and the chance to build a meaningful life." Your letter felt sincere, and sincerity is something I value above all else. Caleb read the letter 3 times. Her handwriting was graceful. Her words carried warmth without pretending to promise affection. For the first time in years, he found himself curious about another person. They exchanged letters throughout the winter. Eleanor wrote about books, gardens, music, and the excitement, and fear, of leaving the only home she had ever known. Caleb wrote about calving season, mountain sunsets, stubborn horses, and the quiet beauty of ranch life. Neither spoke of love. Neither made impossible promises. Instead, they built something unexpected. Trust. By early spring, Eleanor agreed to travel west. Caleb spent the following week preparing the ranch house. He repaired loose floorboards. He painted the guest bedroom. He bought fresh curtains from the general store, though choosing fabric made him far more uncomfortable than breaking wild horses ever had. The ranch hands teased him endlessly. "Didn't know you cared about curtains," one joked. Caleb simply shrugged. "I want the house to be respectable." On the morning Eleanor's stagecoach was due to arrive, Caleb rode into the small frontier town before sunrise. The station buzzed with travelers unloading trunks and greeting relatives. Caleb removed his hat and waited quietly. His stomach tightened with nerves he hadn't expected. Finally, the stagecoach door opened. A young woman stepped carefully onto the wooden platform. She wore a modest blue traveling dress beneath a gray cloak dusted with road dirt. Auburn hair escaped beneath her bonnet after weeks of travel. Though clearly exhausted, she carried herself with quiet dignity. When she looked up, her warm green eyes met Caleb's across the crowd. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Caleb had expected an ordinary arrangement, a practical partnership between strangers. Instead, he found himself speechless. Eleanor smiled gently, not with excitement or certainty, but with hope. Walking toward him with a single worn suitcase in her hand, she stopped only a few feet away. "You must be Mr. Harper," she said softly. Caleb swallowed the lump in his throat before answering. "Yes." He took her suitcase from her hand. "Welcome to Montana, Mrs. Harper." As they climbed into the wagon for the long ride home, both believed they were beginning nothing more than a marriage of convenience. Neither could imagine that this quiet meeting at a dusty frontier station would become the first chapter of a love story that would change both of their lives forever. The ride back to the Harper Ranch was quiet, broken only by the steady clatter of the wagon wheels and the occasional call of meadowlarks drifting across the open prairie. Eleanor sat beside Caleb with her hands folded neatly in her lap, taking in the vast Montana landscape. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. There were no crowded streets, no brick buildings, no constant noise, only rolling grassland stretching toward distant snow-capped mountains beneath an endless blue sky. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Caleb glanced at her. "It can be." She smiled. "And the other times? The winters are hard. Drought comes without warning. Sometimes the land gives everything. Sometimes it takes everything back." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. She understood he wasn't just talking about the ranch. After nearly 2 hours, the Harper Ranch came into view. A sturdy white farmhouse stood beside a large red barn, surrounded by corrals, grazing cattle, and fields beginning to turn green with spring. Several ranch hands looked up from repairing a fence as the wagon approached. One of them grinned. "So she actually came." Another removed his hat respectfully. "Welcome to Harper Ranch, ma'am." Eleanor smiled warmly. "Thank you. I'm pleased to meet all of you." Her kindness immediately surprised the men. Many had expected a frightened city woman who would complain about dust and hard work. Instead, she greeted each person by name after Caleb introduced them, making an effort to remember every face. Inside the farmhouse, Eleanor looked around quietly. The house was clean but plain. Heavy wooden furniture filled the rooms. A stone fireplace dominated the sitting room. The shelves held only a few books, and the walls were bare except for an old family photograph of Caleb and his parents. "It's a lovely home," Eleanor said sincerely. Caleb looked almost embarrassed. "It isn't fancy. It doesn't need to be." She set her small suitcase near the staircase. "It already feels peaceful." Caleb showed her the bedroom he had prepared. Fresh curtains hung over the windows, a handmade quilt covered the bed, and a vase filled with wildflowers rested on the dresser. Eleanor smiled, touched by the thoughtful details. "You did all this?" Caleb cleared his throat. "I wasn't sure what women liked." She laughed softly. "I like it very much." It was the first time Caleb had heard laughter echo through the house in years. That evening, Eleanor insisted on helping prepare supper. Caleb admitted he was more comfortable cooking beans over a campfire than making meals in a kitchen. "I've noticed," she teased after finding 3 different coffee pots hidden in various cupboards. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I kept forgetting where I put them." By the end of the evening, Eleanor had organized the kitchen, baked fresh bread, and prepared a hearty stew using ingredients already stored in the pantry. When Caleb took his first bite, he paused. "This is very good." She smiled. "I'm glad." He wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. The following morning, Eleanor rose before sunrise. She expected to find Caleb already outside, but instead discovered him quietly making coffee. "You don't have to wake so early," he said. "I'd rather share the morning than sleep through it." Together they ate breakfast in comfortable silence before Caleb headed out with the ranch hands. Instead of remaining inside, Eleanor began exploring the property. She noticed broken flower beds near the porch and spent the afternoon clearing weeds and planting wildflowers she had collected nearby. She scrubbed dusty windows until sunlight poured into every room. She mended torn curtains, repaired loose buttons on work shirts, and even stitched a torn saddlebag for one of the ranch hands. Within a week, small changes appeared everywhere. Fresh bread cooled on the kitchen windowsill. Clean curtains fluttered in the breeze. Wildflowers brightened the porch. The once quiet house slowly began to feel like a home. The ranch hands noticed. "I've never seen this place look so cheerful," one remarked. Another laughed. "The boss even smiled yesterday." "I did not," Caleb replied. The men exchanged amused glances. "You almost did." Although Caleb remained reserved, he found himself lingering at supper instead of eating quickly and returning to work. Eleanor often shared stories from Boston, about the children she had taught, the little bakery near her boarding house, and her father's habit of reading novels aloud every Sunday evening. In return, Caleb slowly spoke about the ranch. He explained how to recognize approaching storms by watching the clouds over the mountains. He taught her the names of native wildflowers and pointed out deer trails winding through the hills. One afternoon, Eleanor asked if she could learn to ride properly. "You already know the basics," Caleb said. "I'd like to learn the way ranchers do." He saddled one of the gentlest mares and patiently taught her how to guide the horse across open pasture. Eleanor listened carefully, determined not to give up, even after slipping awkwardly from the saddle into a patch of soft grass. Instead of crying, she laughed. Caleb couldn't help laughing with her. It was a quiet, genuine laugh that surprised them both. As the days turned into weeks, an easy rhythm settled over the Harper Ranch. They were still strangers in many ways, but no longer awkward ones. They worked side by side, shared meals, and gradually learned each other's habits and silences. Yet every evening, after wishing Eleanor good night, Caleb stood alone on the porch, gazing across the moonlit fields. He had promised himself this marriage would be practical, nothing more. But the warmth that now filled his home, the laughter echoing through its halls, and the quiet joy he felt whenever Eleanor smiled were beginning to challenge a promise he had made long ago. For the first time in years, Caleb wondered if perhaps he had been wrong about love. He wasn't ready to admit it, not even to himself, but the lonely ranch no longer felt quite so lonely, and neither did the man who called it home. Spring settled comfortably over the Harper Ranch. Green grass stretched across the hills, newborn calves wandered beside their mothers, and the sound of laughter had become as common around the farmhouse as the morning songs of meadowlarks. Eleanor had found her place on the ranch. She no longer looked like a visitor from Boston. She rode confidently beside Caleb during cattle checks, helped keep the ranch accounts in perfect order, and knew every ranch hand by name. Even the toughest cowboys admitted the Harper Ranch had changed for the better. "Mrs. Harper's got this place running smoother than a brand new wagon," one ranch hand joked. Caleb only smiled faintly. He never said much, but everyone could see the difference. The quiet rancher who once worked from dawn until midnight without pause now returned to the house for supper every evening. Though he still guarded his heart, the walls around it were beginning to crack. Unfortunately, not everyone welcomed the Harper family's happiness. A few miles away stood the sprawling Langston Ranch, owned by Victor Langston, one of the wealthiest cattle barons in the territory. Victor was known for expanding his land by any means necessary. If a neighbor refused to sell, Victor found ways to make life difficult until they changed their minds. For years, he had wanted Caleb's property. Not because of the cattle. Not because of the house. But because a surveyor had recently discovered that a strong underground spring flowed beneath Harper land. In a territory where water meant survival, that spring could make Victor's ranch the most powerful in the county. One afternoon, Victor arrived unannounced. His polished black horse stopped in front of the farmhouse while Caleb repaired a fence nearby. Victor removed his expensive hat with a practiced smile. "Mr. Harper." Caleb nodded. "Mr. Langston." Victor's eyes drifted toward Eleanor, who was hanging freshly washed clothes on the line. "So this must be your new bride." Eleanor offered a polite smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Victor tipped his hat. "The pleasure is mine." But something about the way he looked at the ranch made Eleanor uneasy. After a few moments of small talk, Victor finally spoke plainly. "I'll make this simple." He unfolded several papers from his saddlebag. "I'd like to purchase your ranch." Caleb barely glanced at the documents. "It's not for sale." Victor smiled confidently. "Everyone has a price." "I don't." Victor's smile faded. "You should reconsider." "I already have." Without another word, Caleb turned back toward the broken fence. Victor mounted his horse again. "You'll regret passing up this opportunity." Then he rode away. Eleanor watched him disappear down the trail. "He doesn't seem like a man who enjoys hearing no." Caleb drove another fence post into the ground. "He isn't." Over the following weeks, strange things began happening around the ranch. One morning, several sections of fencing had been cut during the night, allowing dozens of cattle to wander across the open prairie. Another day, 2 valuable horses disappeared from the stable. The sheriff searched but found no evidence. Then supplies ordered from town failed to arrive. The store owner apologized. "I sent everything." Someone had stolen the wagon before it reached the ranch. Caleb suspected Victor but couldn't prove it. The pressure slowly increased. Neighbors quietly warned Caleb that Victor had begun telling people Eleanor wasn't who she claimed to be. "Folks are saying she ran away from trouble back east," one rancher admitted. Another added. "Some are even saying your marriage isn't legal." Eleanor overheard the whispers during a visit to town. Though she kept her head high, the gossip stung. That evening, she sat quietly on the porch while watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Caleb joined her a few minutes later. "You heard?" She nodded. "I did. I'm sorry." She looked at him. "You have nothing to apologize for. But they're talking about you because of me." Eleanor smiled gently. "I've learned something since coming here." "What?" "People who know the truth don't usually waste time arguing with lies." Caleb looked at her in surprise. "You aren't angry?" "Of course it hurts." She folded her hands together. "But I didn't come all this way to run from difficult people." Her calm strength impressed him more than any angry speech could have. The next challenge came only days later. A violent windstorm swept across the valley late one afternoon. While most of the ranch hands struggled to secure the barns, word arrived that several frightened calves had broken through another damaged fence near the river. Without hesitation, Caleb saddled his horse. "I'll get them." "I'm coming with you," Eleanor said. "No. You'll need help. The storm's too dangerous." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm your wife." Before Caleb could argue further, she climbed onto her horse. Together they raced toward the river as thunder rolled across the sky. Rain quickly turned the trails into mud. The frightened calves scattered in every direction. Working side by side, Caleb and Eleanor slowly gathered them, guiding the terrified animals back toward safer ground. At one point, a young calf slipped into the swollen river. Without thinking, Eleanor urged her horse forward, throwing a rope toward the struggling animal. Caleb's heart nearly stopped. Eleanor. With remarkable determination, she secured the rope while Caleb pulled both horse and calf back onto dry ground. Soaked from head to toe, Eleanor laughed with relief. We couldn't leave him. Caleb stared at her. She had risked her own safety without hesitation. Not for money. Not for recognition. But simply because another living creature needed help. As they rode home through the fading storm, Caleb realized something had changed. He had invited Eleanor into his life expecting a practical partner. Instead, he had found someone brave enough to face every hardship beside him. And for the first time since she had arrived, Caleb felt something stronger than gratitude growing quietly in his heart. He wasn't ready to name it yet. But Victor Langston's attempts to break them apart were doing exactly the opposite. With every challenge they faced together, Caleb and Eleanor were becoming less like strangers bound by circumstance, and more like a true husband and wife. The weeks following the storm brought a strange calm to the Harper Ranch. The damaged fences were repaired, the cattle were safely returned, and life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. But something had changed between Caleb and Eleanor. Before the storm, they had been two people sharing the same home. After the storm, they had become partners. Caleb noticed it in the smallest moments. He noticed how Eleanor always left a warm cup of coffee beside his work gloves before he headed outside. He noticed how she hummed softly while tending the garden. He noticed how the ranch hands looked at her with genuine respect, no longer seeing her as a city woman who didn't belong. Most of all, he noticed how empty the house felt whenever she wasn't in it. The realization frightened him. He had spent years convincing himself that he didn't need anyone. That attachment only brought pain. But Eleanor had quietly walked into his life and changed everything without demanding anything in return. Still, there was one thing standing between them. A secret. Caleb had seen the sadness in Eleanor's eyes whenever people mentioned her past. He never pressured her to explain. He believed everyone deserved the right to keep certain memories private. But one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eleanor finally spoke. Caleb. He looked up from the book he was reading. Yes. There is something I should have told you before I came here. The seriousness in her voice immediately caught his attention. Whatever it is, you can tell me. Eleanor looked across the fields, gathering her courage. When I left Boston, I wasn't only looking for a new life. She paused. I was escaping one. Caleb remained silent, allowing her to continue. My father was a respected businessman. After he passed away, his company fell into the hands of his partners. They convinced me that the only way to protect my family's name was to marry Victor Whitmore. Caleb frowned. A man you didn't love? Eleanor shook her head. No. She looked down at her hands. At first, he seemed charming. Everyone admired him. He was wealthy, educated, and polite in public. Her voice became quieter. But behind closed doors, he was different. Caleb's expression hardened. He tried to control everything. Where I went. Who I spoke to. What I wore. He didn't want a wife. He wanted someone who would obey him. The anger in Caleb's eyes grew. Why didn't you tell someone? I tried. Eleanor sighed. But people believed him because he had money and influence. They thought I was being difficult. She looked toward the distant mountains. One night, I realized if I stayed, I would lose myself completely. So you answered the advertisement? Yes. Her voice softened. When I read your letter, I noticed something different. Caleb looked surprised. What? You didn't promise me luxury. You didn't say I would live like a queen. You only promised honesty and respect." She smiled faintly. "That meant more to me than anything else." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers from Eleanor's garden. Caleb finally said, "You should have told me." Eleanor looked worried. "Are you angry?" "No." He shook his head. "I'm angry that someone made you feel like you had no choice." Eleanor studied his face carefully. "You don't think less of me?" Caleb looked almost offended by the question. "Less of you?" He stood and faced her. "Eleanor, you crossed half the country alone. You started over with strangers. You learned a life you had never known. You stood beside me when things got difficult." His voice softened. "I don't know anyone stronger than you." For the first time in years, Eleanor felt tears forming, not from sadness, but from relief. She had spent so long defending herself, explaining herself, proving that she deserved kindness. With Caleb, she didn't have to prove anything. The following days brought them closer than ever. Caleb began sharing things he had never told anyone. He spoke about losing his parents, about the fear of failing the ranch, and about the loneliness he had hidden behind his quiet nature. "I thought needing someone was weakness," he admitted one night. Eleanor smiled gently. "And now?" He looked at her. "Now I'm starting to think maybe it takes more strength to let someone in." Their relationship slowly changed. The distance between them disappeared. They laughed more. They worked together. They began making plans for the future, not as two strangers fulfilling an agreement, but as two people who genuinely cared for each other. But their happiness did not go unnoticed. Victor Langston watched from a distance as the Harper Ranch grew stronger. His attempts to frighten Caleb had failed. His rumors had only brought Caleb and Eleanor closer. And now he realized something dangerous. The woman Caleb had married was not a weakness. She was his greatest strength. Victor clenched his jaw as he looked over the Harper property. "If I can't buy that ranch," he muttered, "I'll have to find another way to take it." While Caleb and Eleanor dreamed of the future, a new threat was approaching. And this time, Victor Langston planned to destroy everything they had built. 5. Part 5, Love Worth Fighting For. Approximately 700 words. The days that followed Victor Langston's threat were filled with tension across the valley. Caleb knew a man like Victor would not simply walk away after being refused. For years, Victor had taken whatever he wanted through money and intimidation, and Caleb understood that his ranch was now more than just land to him. It was a challenge. But this time, Caleb was not facing the battle alone. Eleanor noticed the change in him immediately. He spent longer hours checking fences, inspecting the cattle, and riding the edges of the property. At night, he sat by the fireplace with a worried expression, silently planning how to protect everything they had built. One evening, she placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry every burden by yourself." Caleb looked at her. "It's my responsibility." She shook her head. "No. This is our home." Those simple words stayed with him. For most of his life, Caleb had believed that protecting others meant keeping them away from trouble. But Eleanor had never been someone who needed protecting from life. She wanted to stand beside him, not behind him. So together, they prepared. They strengthened the fences. They moved valuable equipment closer to the barn. They asked trusted neighbors to watch for suspicious activity. The ranch community, once distant, began standing with the Harpers. Eleanor's kindness had earned their respect long before anyone realized it. She had helped injured neighbors, taught children to read, and shared supplies with struggling families. Now those same people were ready to help her. But Victor Langston was not finished. One cold evening, dark clouds covered the sky as strong winds swept across the prairie. The ranch hands rushed to secure the animals before the storm arrived. Caleb was checking the eastern pasture when a rider came racing toward him. "Caleb!" The man's voice was filled with panic. "The barn is on fire." Caleb's heart dropped. He turned his horse immediately and raced back toward the ranch. In the distance, flames rose against the night sky. The main barn, the place where they stored hay, equipment, and some of their finest horses, was burning. "Eleanor!" Caleb shouted as he jumped from his horse. "I'm here." She ran toward him, covered in smoke but unharmed. Relief crossed his face for only a second before he looked toward the burning building. "We need to get the horses out." Without hesitation, Caleb and Eleanor rushed into the chaos. The heat was intense. Smoke filled the air. The terrified animals kicked against their stalls, frightened by the flames. Caleb opened the first stall while Eleanor guided the horses toward safety. "Stay back!" Caleb shouted. But Eleanor refused to leave. Together, they worked through the smoke, saving every animal they could. At one point, a burning beam collapsed near Eleanor. Caleb reached her just in time, pulling her away from danger. For a moment, he held her tightly. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No." But Caleb's hands trembled. Not because of the fire. Because he had almost lost her. After hours of fighting the flames, the fire was finally controlled. The barn was badly damaged, but the horses were safe, and the family home remained standing. As dawn approached, neighbors arrived with supplies and tools. Everyone helped clean the damage and rebuild what had been destroyed. During the investigation, the sheriff discovered evidence that the fire had not been accidental. Tracks near the barn and a witness statement pointed toward men connected to Victor Langston. The truth finally came out. Victor had ordered the attack. The entire community turned against him. The same people he had intimidated for years now stood together against him. When the sheriff confronted Victor, he could no longer hide behind his wealth and influence. Witnesses came forward about his threats, illegal actions, and attempts to force neighbors off their land. Victor Langston was arrested. The Harper Ranch survived. But the fire had changed something deeper than their property. It had destroyed the last walls between Caleb and Eleanor. That evening, as they sat together outside their damaged but standing home, Caleb stared at the woman beside him. "When you arrived here," he said quietly, "I thought I was getting a partner for a practical arrangement." Eleanor smiled softly. "And what did you get?" Caleb took her hand. "Someone who gave me a reason to come home." Her eyes filled with emotion. "I never expected to find happiness here." "Neither did I." He looked toward the sunrise spreading across the fields. "I spent years believing love was something other people were lucky enough to have." He turned back to her. "But then you walked into my life." For the first time, Caleb said the words he had been afraid to speak. "I love you, Eleanor." A tear rolled down her cheek as she smiled. "I love you too." The marriage that had started as an agreement between two strangers had become something neither of them thought possible. It was no longer a marriage of necessity. It was a choice. And they chose each other. Years passed after the night the Harper barn burned, but the memory never faded completely. The fire had taken away wood, tools, and years of stored supplies, but it had also revealed something far more valuable, the strength of the bond between Caleb and Eleanor. The ranch was rebuilt stronger than before. With the help of neighbors and friends, the damaged barn was replaced with a larger structure. New fences surrounded the pastures, fresh crops grew in the fields, and the Harper cattle became known throughout the territory for their quality. But the greatest change was not in the land. It was in the home. The once silent farmhouse that Caleb had lived in alone for so many years was now filled with sounds he never thought he would hear again. Laughter. Footsteps. Music. The voices of children. Caleb often stood outside on the porch in the evening, watching Eleanor teach their children how to care for the garden or listening as she read stories beside the fireplace. Sometimes he still found it hard to believe that the lonely rancher who once thought he was destined to live without love now had everything he had never allowed himself to dream about. A family. A home. A reason to smile. Eleanor had changed the Harper Ranch, but more importantly, she had changed Caleb. The man who once kept everyone at a distance had learned to share his thoughts, his fears, and his hopes. He no longer saw love as a weakness. He finally understood that allowing someone into your heart was not losing control, it was gaining something worth protecting. One autumn evening, many years after Eleanor first arrived, Caleb found her sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The same porch where they had once shared their deepest fears. He sat beside her. "You remember the day you arrived?" Eleanor smiled. "How could I forget?" She laughed softly. "I was exhausted, covered in dust, and wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You thought that?" "For about 5 minutes." He smiled. "Only 5?" She looked at him playfully. "Maybe 10." They both laughed. The sound reminded Caleb of how different life had become. Back then, he had stood at that train station expecting a stranger who would simply help him manage his household. Instead, he had met a woman who challenged him, supported him, and taught him that a person's greatest treasure was not land or money. It was love. "I used to think I knew exactly what my future would look like," Caleb said. Eleanor turned toward him. "And now?" He looked across the fields where their children played. "Now I know I couldn't have imagined anything this good." Eleanor reached for his hand. "Neither could I." Their story became something people in the territory often spoke about. They talked about the cold-hearted rancher who learned to laugh again. They talked about the woman from Boston who arrived with only a suitcase but brought warmth to an entire community. They talked about how a marriage that began without romance became one of the strongest examples of devotion anyone had ever seen. Young couples would visit the Harper Ranch seeking advice, and Caleb would always tell them the same thing. Don't search for someone perfect. He would glance at Eleanor with a smile. Find someone willing to build something with you. Because he knew the truth. Love was not always found in grand promises or perfect beginnings. Sometimes it arrived quietly. Sometimes it came riding across a dusty road with a worn suitcase and uncertain dreams. Sometimes it began as a simple agreement between two lonely people who believed they were only offering each other a home. But if they were brave enough to open their hearts, that agreement could become something far greater. A lifetime. A family. A love that changed everything. Caleb Harper had prepared for a cold, loveless marriage because he believed that was all life had left to offer him. Then Eleanor Brooks stepped onto his ranch. And she showed him that even the most broken hearts could find their way home.